In the spring of 1861, in an office on Wall Street, a man signed his name to a contract that would help arm the Union. In that same season, an ocean away in a townhouse in Paris, a different banking house was already laying the groundwork for a contract that would help arm the Confederacy. Neither government seemed to know the full shape of the other deal. Neither cared to find out, because in the world these men occupied, the war itself was never the point. The war was the opportunity. This is the story of how the American Civil War, the bloodiest conflict in the nation's history, was financed, hedged, and quietly profited from by a small network of banking houses on both sides of the Atlantic. Men who lent money to the Union with one hand, and in some cases, through intermediaries, kept the door open to Confederate credit with the other. Men who understood something the generals never fully grasped, that armies march on money, and whoever controls the money rarely finishes the war poorer than they started it. By the time the guns fell silent at Appomattox, roughly $3 billion had moved through the hands of a financial network most Americans had never heard of. $3 billion at a time when the entire pre-war federal budget barely broke $70 million. Hold on to that number. It will come back, and each time it returns, it will mean something slightly different. Let's go back to the beginning, to a decade before the first shot was fired, when the money had already started choosing sides, long before any soldier had. Long before Fort Sumter, the American economy was tangled deep in European credit. Southern cotton planters didn't sell their crop for cash on delivery. They sold it forward against future harvests through a web of factors and brokers who answered, ultimately, to banking houses in London, Liverpool, and Paris. Northern railroads and industry ran on the same kind of leverage, bonds issued in New York, but purchased in London, drawing rooms by investors who had never once set foot on the land they were financing. This meant that when war became likely, the great banking houses of Europe were not neutral bystanders waiting to see who would win. They were already creditors to both halves of a nation about to tear itself apart. Their money was already inside the machine before the machine started killing people. The most important of these houses, for our purposes, was the House of Rothschild and its American representative, a German-born financier named August Belmont. Belmont had built his career as the Rothschilds' man in New York, marrying into old political money and becoming a fixture of the Democratic Party establishment. When war broke out, Belmont positioned himself publicly as a Union financier, helping place government bonds with European investors and using his transatlantic connections to keep foreign capital flowing north when Washington needed it most. But the Rothschild network's loyalty was never to a flag. It was to solvency. And solvency during a civil war could be found in the debts of whichever side looked, at any given moment, like the safer bet. Here is the first thread in the pattern. While Belmont worked publicly to fund the Union's war machine, the wider European banking establishment he represented was simultaneously extending credit lines that touched Confederate cotton exports. The same cotton that, once smuggled through the blockade and sold in Liverpool, generated the hard currency the South desperately needed to buy rifles, powder, and warships. The Union fought to choke off Southern ports. The financiers who profited from the cotton trade fought, in their own quiet and far less visible way, to keep that cotton moving regardless of who ultimately controlled the ports it left from. Blockade running itself became its own quiet industry, and European capital financed both the ships and the insurance that made the trade viable. Sleek, purpose-built steamers, often financed by British investment syndicates, slipped past Union warships under cover of darkness, carrying cotton out and manufactured arms in. The men who financed these vessels rarely touched a weapon themselves. They simply calculated the odds of a successful run against the potential payout, priced the risk accordingly, and collected their share whether the ship's cargo ultimately helped prolong a war that was, by 1863, already killing thousands of men a month. Now turn to Paris and to the House of Erlanger, the deal that gives this story its sharpest edge. In 1863, with the Confederacy's credit collapsing and its currency losing value by the week, a French banking house led by Emile Erlanger structured what became known as the Confederate Cotton Loan. It was an elegant piece of financial engineering, built by men who understood that investors didn't need to believe the Confederacy would win, they only needed to believe the bonds could be sold before anyone else stopped believing. European investors would buy Confederate bonds, but instead of being backed by a government whose survival was genuinely uncertain, the bonds were convertible into cotton the Confederacy still physically controlled, sitting in warehouses, waiting for the blockade to break or the war to end in its favor. The loan raised roughly $15 million for a government that was, by any conventional financial measure, a catastrophic credit risk. It worked because Erlanger didn't need the Confederacy to win. He needed the bonds to stay tradable long enough to extract his commission and let early investors cash out before the bottom fell through. And that is precisely what happened. Erlanger's house took a commission reported at nearly 5% off the top, structured the bonds so early sellers could realize handsome profits, and by the time the Confederacy's fortunes collapsed in 1864 and 1865, most of the original downside risk had already been quietly passed down the chain to smaller, later, and far less informed investors. $15 million raised. A 5% commission banked before a single cannon decided the loan's fate. Add that figure to the $3 billion, and start to see how the number grows, not from one grand conspiracy, but from dozens of smaller, perfectly legal transactions stacked on top of each other. Meanwhile, on the Union side, a different financier was building an even larger fortune doing the mirror image of the same job, legally, publicly, and on a far greater scale than anything Erlanger managed in Paris. J. Cooke was a Philadelphia banker who essentially invented modern American war bond marketing. Where Erlanger sold Confederate bonds to European aristocrats in private drawing rooms, Cooke sold Union bonds directly to ordinary Americans, farmers, shopkeepers, factory workers, schoolteachers, through an army of subagents, saturation newspaper advertising, and relentless patriotic appeals. It was, in a meaningful sense, the first mass-marketed government debt campaign in American history, and it worked because it made buying a bond feel indistinguishable from an act of loyalty. Cooke's firm underwrote and distributed roughly $800 million in Union bonds over the course of the war, and he collected a commission on nearly every dollar that passed through his hands. Here is where the pattern sharpens further. Cooke was not simply a patriot performing a public service, though that was the story he told, and largely the story history chose to remember. He was compensated at a scale that made him one of the wealthiest men in America by the war's end, a fortune built directly, dollar for dollar, on the government's desperate and escalating need for cash to keep the war machine running. The worse the war went, the more bonds needed to be sold. The more bonds that needed to be sold, the more Cooke's firm earned in commissions. His incentive and the Union's survival happened to point in the same direction, but only because the war was expensive enough to make him rich either way. They didn't care who won the war, they cared who owed them money. That refrain will return again, because it describes almost every figure in this story. It describes Belmont, positioned to profit whether Union credit held or European capital found other channels south. It describes Erlanger, whose commission was locked in before a single Confederate bond ever defaulted. And it describes, perhaps most cynically of all, the gold speculators operating on both sides of the Atlantic, men who bet, quite openly, on Union battlefield defeats, because bad news for the Union meant a spike in gold prices and a fortune for anyone positioned correctly the day before the headlines broke. This gold speculation deserves its own moment, because it may be the starkest single example of financiers treating the war as nothing more than a market signal rather than a national catastrophe. In New York, a so-called gold room operated for most of the war, where traders bet on the price of gold relative to the increasingly distrusted paper, greenbacks, the Union printed to fund the fight. Every Union defeat sent gold prices soaring, as investors lost faith in Union paper currency. Every Union victory sent gold prices falling just as sharply. Traders with advanced knowledge, sometimes from telegraph operators willing to sell a few minutes head start, sometimes from officers willing to leak a battlefield result before it reached Washington, could and did make fortunes off the deaths of soldiers hours before the public even knew a battle had happened. The Union government hated the gold room with real intensity. Congress briefly outlawed gold trading altogether in 1864, convinced the speculation was actively undermining the war effort by tanking confidence in the currency at the worst possible moments. It didn't work. The market simply moved underground into private offices and back rooms, and the speculation continued largely unchanged, just further from public view. Before we widen the frame to the government level, there's one more figure worth naming, because his story shows how easily the line between financier and profiteer could blur when nobody was watching closely enough. In the summer of 1861, a young banker connected to the House of Morgan was involved in a transaction that would later become known as the Hall Carbine Affair. A batch of outdated, defective carbine rifles, Army surplus, sold off cheaply by the government itself, were purchased by private buyers for roughly $3.50 apiece, then resold back to the Union Army at more than $20 apiece, a markup north of 500%, financed in part through connections to northeastern banking capital. The rifles were so poor in quality that soldiers using them in the field reportedly risked injury from the weapons themselves. A congressional investigation later scrutinized the deal, and while the full extent of any individual banker's direct culpability remained a matter of dispute, the episode became one of the most notorious symbols of Civil War-era war profiteering. proof that it wasn't only bond markets and gold speculation, where fortunes were made off a desperate government's need for anything that could be shipped to the front lines fast enough. This is the texture underneath the larger financial architecture we've been describing. It wasn't one grand, centralized conspiracy run from a single boardroom. It was dozens of smaller opportunities, a rifle contract here, a cotton loan there, a gold trade timed around a leaked battle report, all made possible by the same underlying condition: two governments locked in an existential, all-consuming war, both willing to pay almost any price to almost anyone for the resources needed to keep fighting one more month. And that condition, desperate governments willing to pay nearly any price, is exactly the environment in which the biggest financial houses always find their greatest opportunities, not in peacetime stability, but in the chaos where ordinary rules of caution get suspended in the name of survival. Now widen the frame, because the dual financing pattern goes beyond individual bankers and touches the very structure of how both governments paid for the war, and more importantly, what that structure left behind once the fighting stopped. The Confederacy, denied access to most European government credit and increasingly strangled by the Union blockade, leaned harder and harder on schemes like Erlanger's, private financiers willing to structure clever instruments in exchange for a cut, regardless of the underlying government's survival odds. By 1864, Confederate currency had inflated so catastrophically that a pair of boots costing $5 at the war's start cost several hundred by its end. The financiers who had extracted their commissions early were long gone, and long since paid, by the time that collapse finally arrived for everyone else still holding Confederate paper. The Union, meanwhile, solved its financing crisis through a combination of Cooke's marketing machine and a piece of legislation that reshaped American finance permanently: the Legal Tender Act of 1862, which created the greenback, and the National Banking Acts of 1863 and 1864, which built an entirely new system of federally chartered banks required to hold government bonds as reserves. This wasn't just wartime improvisation dressed up as policy. It was the foundation of a modern American banking system, one designed, in no small part, by men who understood that whoever controls the currency controls the country long after the shooting stops and the treaties are signed. That is the quiet, uncomfortable center of this story. The Civil War didn't just decide the question of Union and slavery. It also became the proving ground for a new financial architecture, one where a small circle of banking houses, some publicly loyal to the Union, some privately willing to extend a hand to the Confederacy when the price was right, all walked away wealthier than when the war began, regardless of who carried the flag into Appomattox Courthouse. August Belmont remained one of the most powerful men in American finance for another 2 decades after the war ended, eventually helping structure the deals that would define Wall Street well into the Gilded Age, and serving for years as chairman of the Democratic National Committee, political influence purchased, in no small part, by wartime financial credibility. J. Cooke's firm, flush with wartime commissions and convinced the same formula would work in peacetime, expanded aggressively into post-war railroad financing, a decision that would eventually collapse spectacularly and trigger the Panic of 1873, one of the worst depressions in American history. But that collapse came only after Cooke had already banked one of the great personal fortunes of the era. The Erlanger name remained attached to European finance for generations afterward, its Confederate misadventure a mere footnote next to the far larger fortunes the house went on to build elsewhere in Europe. $3 billion moved through this network before the war ended. $3 billion extracted through commissions, interest payments, currency speculation, marked-up war material, and bond markups, while soldiers on both sides were paid in increasingly worthless paper and asked to die for causes the financiers themselves treated, fundamentally, as a market position to be hedged rather than a cause to be won or lost. It is worth pausing on just how permanent the consequences of that financial architecture turned out to be, because the story doesn't really end at Appomattox. The national banking system built to fund the Union survived the war by decades, shaping American finance well into the 20th century. The relationships forged between Washington and a handful of northeastern banking houses during the crisis became the template for how the federal government would raise emergency capital in every major conflict that followed. The same basic playbook of bond drives, patriotic marketing, and privileged access for a small circle of underwriters would resurface, almost unchanged in its core mechanics, during the Spanish-American War, both world wars and beyond. The Civil War didn't just produce a template for winning a war, it produced a template for financing one, and for who gets paid first when the bill comes due. Meanwhile, the men who built their fortunes on that 4-year window of desperation didn't retreat from public life once the guns fell silent. They moved deeper into it. Post-war railroad expansion, industrial consolidation, and the financial engineering that would come to define the Gilded Age were disproportionately shaped by capital, connections, and confidence built during the war years. The same names that structured Union bonds and Confederate cotton loans reappear, again and again, in the financing of the transcontinental railroads, the great industrial trusts, and the banking panics that periodically swept through the late 19th century. The war was, in this sense, less an interruption of American capitalism's development than an accelerant for it. So return to that spring of 1861, a contract signed on Wall Street, a contract quietly taking shape in Paris, two governments about to spend 4 years and hundreds of thousands of lives deciding the future of a continent, and a small, interconnected network of men who had already decided, long before the first shot was fired at Fort Sumter, that there was no realistic outcome in which they personally came out behind. The war ended, the profits didn't. And if you think that pattern belonged only to the 1860s, that no modern conflict has ever been quietly financed, directly or indirectly, on more than one side by the same overlapping networks of capital, that's worth sitting with for a moment before you decide you already know the answer. History remembers the generals. It remembers the battles, the speeches, the emancipation, the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. It rarely remembers the men in the counting houses who never once picked up a rifle, yet shaped how long the war lasted, how it was paid for, and who was left holding the debt once it was over. That absence from the popular memory is not an accident. It is, in its own way, the final and most durable piece of financial engineering in this entire story. Tell me in the comments, do you think this kind of dual-sided war financing still happens today, just with better disguises?